Welcome to the first of the GRADNAS seminar series for 2024. Convened by Professor Evelyn Goh, GRADNAS is a network of scholars working on Asian security and the international relations of Asia. GRADNAS is based at the Australian National University in Canberra. Professor Goh is traveling at the moment and unfortunately will not be able to join us this morning. So as is customary, I would like to say the following on behalf of the ANU. The Australian National University acknowledges, celebrates, and pays our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and work, and whose cultures are amongst the oldest continuing cultures in human history. The theme for the 2024 GRADNAS seminar series is the historical international relations of Asia. I will be convening the 2024 seminar series and have the somewhat unusual role this morning of also being the first speaker. So thank you for indulging me. I'm Manjeet Pardesi from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. I met some of you at the GRADNAS Methods Go Lab in Canberra in December last year, and some of the others at ISA in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago. So it's great to see you online again, and it's also wonderful to see many other friends and colleagues. So thank you for being here, and a very warm welcome to you. I will be kickstarting our 2024 seminar series by making a presentation on my paper titled Interconnected Asian History and Open World Orders. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to let you know that we have a fantastic lineup of scholars for you in the months and weeks ahead. Next month, we will have Naosuke Mukoyama, who will talk to us about state making in historical Japan. And in the weeks and months ahead, we will have Lina Ben-Abdallah, Victoria Hui, and a bunch of other scholars that we are still in the process of lining up. So please stay tuned. Before proceeding, I would also like to thank Tommy Chai for managing the logistics of the GRADNAS seminar series and the publicity, etc., while busily working on his PhD thesis as well. So once again, good morning and welcome. I will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes or so, and that should give us plenty of time for questions and discussion. So I am now going to share my screen, so please bear with me. So my paper is called Can you all see it? Tommy, is this working for everybody?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So my paper is called Interconnected Asian History and Open World Orders. And I guess the larger point that I am trying to make is that Asia has always been interconnected. Of course, I will emphasize the interconnections in my paper in particular periods and the implications for the world orders thereof. These interconnections, my argument goes, creates what I call open world orders. And in that sense, open world orders are different from how we have traditionally conceptualized historical international orders in Asia, is what I intend to demonstrate. So we all know that over the last 2 decades or so, there has been what scholars refer to as a global and an historical turn in international relations. So I kind of want to talk about that briefly. But before I do that, here is a large overview of my presentation itself. I will talk about how we have approached, historical systems in IR, especially to do with Asia. I'll focus on East Asia in particular. I'll also talk a little bit about Eurocentrism and Sinocentrism that informs this scholarship. And it's within that context that I'm trying to make an intervention. I'm specifically adopting a global historical approach, the global turn, if you like, to talk about open international orders. So I'll try to emphasize the significance of the interconnections between South and East Asia in 2 particular periods, or with 2 particular processes, rather, if you like. The process of the spread of Buddhism from South Asia to East Asia in the first millennium, and of course, the colonial period. And I will try to show that when we look at East Asia within a connected framework with South Asia, we actually have a very different perspective that we develop rather than looking at East Asia in isolation or East Asia in isolation with Europe alone in the colonial period. And like I said, my larger conclusion is that historical Asia was an interconnected system of open world orders that were partially and unevenly overlapping. So here I have a quote for you from John Hobson from 2016, where he is extremely critical of what he calls the Eurocentric nature of IR theory. And his larger point is that for IR scholarship writ large, when it comes to theory development, it is European and Western history that is essentially world history, which is used as the basis for theory development and the development of concepts, insights, etc. And in fact, he says, it's Plato to NATO story from ancient Greece to the modern West, and none of the way stations in this journey is non-European / non-Western. We know that there has been, nevertheless, a turn towards history and a global turn over the last decade or so. But my larger point is that this larger Eurocentrism still continues to inform, even if implicitly, in some way, shape, or form, our understanding. And that's what point that I'm trying to make in this current paper. So more specifically, how other regions are grouped and conceptualized in this historical turn is what I want to talk about. And some of the points that I wish to make is that when we look at historical international systems, we take the contemporary regional divisions of the world and think of them as past international systems. So not just that, we also think of these regions as discrete and existing independently and in vacuum and in isolation from each other. I also think that when we talk about the creation of the modern international system, we tend to adopt a core periphery model of Europe and each of these discrete regions interacting with each other. But nevertheless, as I will try to show, South and East Asia were connected in those two periods in particular ways that I was talking about. But just to emphasize how deep this particular Eurocentric way of thinking, even with the historical turn, is I kind of want to emphasize some of the core works, if you like, on historical international systems. So here we have Bull and Watson's classic, The Expansion of the International Society. And they explicitly and very clearly state that before the expansion of Europe beginning in the late 15th century, there were multiple regional international systems in the world. Each of these regional international systems for Bull and Watson were discrete. They had their distinctive rules and institutions underpinned by a dominant culture, and they are very explicit. They tell us contacts among these regional international systems were much more limited. And in fact, there was no single set of rules or institutions operating across the boundaries of what they think of as these regional international systems. They further argue that it is not they who are Eurocentric. They say that the historical record itself is Eurocentric. And that's my point. So what are these regions? Where are they coming from? How do we think about them? And in the two periods and the two processes that I'm talking about linked to Buddhism and to colonialism, East Asia and South Asia were actually interconnected, and they belie some of the assertions that Bull and Watson's statements seem to be making. So here I also have, the first page of the table of contents for you from Watson's The Evolution of International Society. So when they think of other international systems outside of Europe, that is, we go with contemporary countries like Persia, India, or China becoming past international systems, Or sometimes we go with contemporary regions as becoming past international systems. So like the Arab Islamic Middle East becomes a system, the Mongol Tatar Central Asia becomes a system, India becomes a system. In fact, they are very explicit. They even Watson is very explicit in this piece. He even says that even the three Islamic systems were not really one system. They were completely distinct. And we know that at that point in time, the English school scholars made a distinction between international system and international society. So not only were they completely different international systems, they were also completely different international orders. And that's my point. Discrete and containerized regions and contemporary divisions of the world as past international systems. But it's not just Bull and Watson and the English school. The other big book that we have, The Balance of Power in World History, that looks at a bunch of chapters across time and space, talks about, for example, South Asia as a discrete international system for 2,210 years, and East Asia as a discrete international system for 2,900 years for the purposes of the balancing versus hegemony debate, at least. But this is what I find surprising again. For thousands of years, we are told that they lived in their little worlds and had nothing at all to do of any consequence with each other. The funny thing also is that while in the European case, we are allowed to have a separate classical Mediterranean compared to a modern Europe, in the East Asian case, that China of the first millennium BC becomes East Asia subsequently, apparently is of no consequence. And that's my point about these timeless regions. They reflect a Eurocentric mindset of a completely different sort. And that's why my intervention is that we need a global turn. But before I get there, I also want to talk a little bit about how East Asia itself has been approached. Now, given this historical turn in IR scholarship, at least my feeling is, and I could be wrong, but my feeling is that East Asia is arguably the most analyzed historical region, system, order, whatever you want to call it, outside of Europe, and has been over the last 20 years or so. It's a small body of scholarship, obviously, compared to Europe, but a rapidly growing one and the most studied region/system outside of Europe. But our understanding of this East Asia is troubled by this legacy of Eurocentrism, and it brings in, as a consequence, the problem of Sinocentrism. So let me explain what I mean by that. So John Fairbank is associated with the popularization and the definition of the term East Asia itself in the period between the 1940s and 1960s. Now, the way East Asia is defined, and I want to emphasize, the East Asia that Fairbank was talking about was China, Japan, Korea, and northern Vietnam. Fairbank is very clear that he's talking about what he thinks of as the Chinese culture area. Furthermore, Fairbank also argues that geographically, this East Asian region was separate and most distinctive of all the regions of the pre-modern world, if you like. And here I can already hear echoes from the Bull and Watson approach. First of all, the emphasis on cultural distinctiveness, and secondly, the discrete and containerized version. So by definition, Fairbank told us that this was a closed system completely separate from West and South Asia. And because of the emphasis on Chinese culture in the definition of this region, it is by definition Sinocentric. Moving along with Sinocentric East Asia in more contemporary scholarship, so the volume edited by Haggard and Kang that came out in 2020, we are told that over the very long durée, roughly 2,000 years, there was a China-centered system in East Asia. But they also tell us simultaneously that the Sui-Tang unification created a regional system because it was at that point in time that modern states, not modern, I'm sorry, but states, recognizable Korean and Japanese states emerged in East Asia. So in that period of the middle of the first millennium is when a truly regional East Asian system came into being that lasted until the 19th century. And of course, the prior problem that I mentioned, China becomes East Asia, and that is kind of somehow glossed over because we are working with one simple term, East Asia. We are also told that the system lasted until the 19th century. And what opened this closed system, we are told, is this expanding Europe through the form of Westphalian norms and European victories on the Chinese periphery. We know that Japan, of course, modernized by absorbing these, Westphalian norms, if you like. By contrast, what I wish to emphasize in this paper is that during the Sui Tang period, the chief Buddhist period of interconnections between South and East Asia, in fact, there was no closed system in East Asia. And in fact, South Asia and East Asia were deeply interconnected. And in fact, I'm going to be making a case for open orders during precisely this period when a truly regional system, in fact, did emerge. Next, I'm going to argue that, in fact, this was not Sinocentric because China was not at the center of this system. In fact, China consciously felt that it was at the borderland of this system. And likewise, in the 19th century, when this seemingly closed system was being opened, what I'm going to try to show is that the interconnections with South Asia and India were as important. It was not just an encounter between Europe and East Asia, but a three-way encounter that also included South Asia. And to do this, I think we need to turn to not just history, but to global history. And that's why the global turn that I have been talking about. So what is global history and how do we think and what do we make of global history when it comes to IR? Now, I want to emphasize, I'm of course not a historian, I'm an IR scholar, and global history is not a history of the globe, as it were, as the term sometimes makes it sound like. But global history is actually a form of historical analysis. It's a form of historical analysis in which we imagine, not as in terms of concoction, but we imagine different spatial configurations than the received spatial configurations that we are given in the traditional division of the world that I've been talking about. So in other words, the global of global history is an interconnected space, if you like. And this global realm need not necessarily be planetary as long as it is translocal. And that's the emphasis of global history, because the emphasis in global history is on connections between what we sometimes think of as different and distinct parts of the world. So in terms of approach, that's the approach I'm taking in this paper. But very interestingly, in the scholarship on East Asia itself, there has been a global turn when it comes to history. And as Holcomb has argued, that one of the most exciting avenues of scholarship over the last 20 years or so to do with the East Asian past has demonstrated is that East Asia was in fact not closed and isolated as the Fairbankian assumption makes it out to be. In fact, Holcomb has shown, and Holcomb and Valerie Hansen and a bunch of other scholars have shown that actually East Asia was deeply connected with other parts of Eurasia for all of history. So that's global history and East Asian historical scholarship that is emerging. But also within IR itself, we have had a global turn. And scholars like George Lawson, Spanu, Roy Smith, etc., have told us that the international is not a pre-given. And in fact, the international needs to be determined through empirical inquiry. So in that sense, we cannot take East Asia or South Asia by definition as a past international system. What were the spatial configurations of a system need to be determined through analysis. Given this larger context, I make the case for open orders, and I adopt Iran's relatively simple definition for order because I think of this work, what I'm trying to do, as a first cut as opposed to a final word on these things. So I approach order as partly descriptive and partly normative, shaped through interconnections as Iran emphasized. These interconnections are the same as what Barry Busan and Richard Little have elsewhere referred to as politico-military, politico-economic, and ideational interactions. In fact, Busan and Little's definition of an international system is precise, a full international system rather, is precisely a system where all three of these interactions are indeed taking place. And we also know that the newer, relatively newer English school scholarship makes less of a distinction between international system and international society. So for the purposes of this preliminary paper, I would like to say that I'm approaching system and order as somewhat, I'm using the terms system and order somewhat interchangeably given these definitions by Aron and Busan and Little. And therefore, my empirical contention, of course, is whether or not South Asia and East Asia were interconnected or not, it cannot be assumed by definitional or analytical fiat as the Fairbankian view tends to do. And we have to ascertain it through description itself. So description is a part of the enterprise of understanding order, and especially open order, as I'm trying to make a case for. And at the same time, the normative dimension, of course, remains important because these interconnections and these interactions need to be transformative for the order to be truly open. And I ascertain this transformation through, a bunch of things. Perhaps a change in the mode of interaction itself, a change in the actor's cognition, a change in the actor's identity, to be able to show that the normative change, in fact, did take place. For it to be a truly open order beyond mere interactions. So given this larger, background rooted in how scholarship has evolved and what terms I'm using in terms of definitions and concepts, let me now turn to the first of my two cases. The first case, of course, has to do with Buddhism and Sino-Indian or South Asian, East Asian interactions in large parts of the first millennium, with a focus on the Sui Tang period in particular. Now, Tan Sen has shown that in the early Tang period, more than 50 embassies were exchanged between the Tang and various polities in India. And in fact, we see the full range of politico-cultural, politico-economic, and politico-military interactions taking place in this period. Also in the preceding period, actually, but this period in historical scholarship is better documented. So I'm using this for the purposes of illustration. We know that in an ideational or a cultural sense, the Buddhist links were the most prominent between South Asia and East Asia in this period. We also know that Buddhism actually spread, quote unquote, spread along the so-called Silk Roads. I don't quite like the term Silk Roads, but that's a separate discussion, but I'm just using it here for the purposes of illustration as a heuristic. And these Silk Roads, of course, existed both along the continental and maritime dimensions. So there was clearly a politico-economic and a politico-cultural dimension. There's some debate in the historical scholarship whether Buddhism was using the trade circuits or whether trade was using the Buddhist circuits. But what is well established is that the two actually went hand in hand and went together. But at the same time, there was also politico-military interaction between Tang China and various Indic polities. In fact, it might come as a surprise to some of you that there was a period in history where the Chinese Empire and some polities in India even allied against an expansionist Tibet. They also allied against expansionist Arabs. In fact, there was also a military intervention by Tang China in northern India in this period. So we have the full range of interactions to make a truly international system. So the international, needs to be determined empirically, like I was saying. But given the Silk Road connections and the inclusion of Arabs, etc., what I also wish to emphasize is that Sino-Indian interactions were themselves embedded within much larger Pan-Asian interactions. And in that sense, my argument is simply a first cut and not the final word on whatever I'm going to say conceptually in the next couple of slides. In this period in particular, for my paper, I focus on Buddhism and the normative impact of Buddhism. So I want to spend some time talking about that. we don't have the full range of Buddhist travelers between China and India, and there were travelers in both directions. But we know that the three most famous Buddhist travelers from China to India were Faxian, Xuanzang, and Yijing. And Xuanzang being the most famous of them all, because we know that the Ming dynasty classic Journey to the West is an apocryphal account of Xuanzang's journey to India in the 7th century. But Xuanzang did have some very interesting things to tell us. And among the things that he tells us is that people of distant places with diverse customs generally designate the land that they admire as India and not China. And that's kind of important, especially because we are talking about center and periphery, etc. And the other point I wish to make is that in the Sinocentric definition, China is a spreader of culture because Fairbank defined it as the Chinese culture area, as I showed in one of the previous slides. But what I wish to emphasize through these Buddhist connections is that actually China was a seeker of knowledge and not a spreader of civilization, at least in this period. And I'm going to make it more complex, and I have more to say about that, obviously. But I kind of want to continue a little bit about the Buddhist impact on China itself. We are also told that Buddhism actually had an impact on all, emphasis being on all aspects of Chinese life. And we don't have a comprehensive book that looks at all of these interactions. But we have specialist studies tucked away here and there. So I have a non-exhaustive list for you, which includes art, architecture, music, dance, drama, language, including 35,000 new words being introduced into the Chinese language as a result of the Buddhist connections. But also Jacques Garnet has shown that new financial institutions were also introduced into China at the same time. And these financial institutions were linked with the spread of Buddhist monasteries because these Buddhist monasteries had a role in legitimizing the emperor itself, and therefore they created a tax-exempt status, or tried to create a tax-exempt status for themselves, while also patronizing merchants connecting the corridors between China, India, and other parts of the Buddhist Silk Roads, if you like. And Charles Holcomb, who told us about an interconnected and open East Asia, as mentioned in a previous slide, has also told us that this cultural flow, in this period at least, was entirely one way from India to China, because we don't know, based on current scholarship, whether there was any thinnification, if you like, of India, because the cultural flow seems to be in the other direction. But it's not just about, for me, the importance of Buddhism is not about religion or culture in the absolute sense of the term itself. For me, the significance of Buddhism is because of its impact on state making and because of its impact on world order itself. So in the Sinocentric view, we are told that the notion of a universal kingship, that's what Yongjin Chang and Barry Busan told us, in their article on the tributary system as an international society, that universal kingship is the key to the Sinocentric world. And in fact, we are also told that the mandate of heaven is the legitimizing ideology, if you like. So as per this thinking, it is the Chinese son of heaven, the emperor, who has received the mandate of heaven to rule all under heaven, the world. That is what creates this universal kingship. But by contrast, what I would like to show is that in this period, actually, Buddhist universal kingship was perhaps even more significant than Chinese universal kingship. So when the Sui dynasty reunified, quote unquote, reunified China, the first Sui emperor called himself the Bodhisattva son of heaven. In other words, the legitimizing ideology was not just the traditional Chinese one with the emphasis on son of heaven, but one that also emphasized Buddhism. Likewise, Valerie Hansen has shown us that the so-called, what she calls the the synthesis of when it comes to state making, also included Buddhism as a crucial blueprint. And the early Tang rulers, in fact, sought to rule as the ideal Chakravartin or universal Buddhist kings who ruled according to the morals and the precepts of Buddhism itself. So in other words, what we are seeing is a version of Buddhist universal kingship and not just the traditional Chinese one. And this is significant because the Sui, quote unquote, unified China after 300 years of disunion, which in fact makes this a completely distinct polity, a different Chinese polity from whatever the previous unification was all about. Again, Charles Holcomb has told us that by the 6th century, in fact, Indian Buddhist scriptures were more popular all across China than native Chinese Confucian ones. And it's in that context that legitimization of imperial rulership through Buddhist precepts of universal rule become very important. Because in this Buddhist universal rulership, the emperor needs to have the backing of the monastery. The monastery is supported by traders and visited by commoners. And it's this interaction that legitimizes the centrality and the legitimacy of emperorship itself. And the ideal emperor in this Buddhist literature on statecraft is the Indic-Buddhist emperor Ashoka from the 3rd century BC. Of course, he had been idealized in Buddhist hagiography and in Buddhist texts by this time. So Chinese emperors, whether the first Sui emperor or some of the Tang emperors, actually sought to emulate and surpass whatever these Buddhist texts were saying about Ashoka. In other words, the peer that China sought to emulate and surpass was from another tradition altogether. Furthermore, feminist scholars have also told us that ideologically conceived as the son of heaven, the Chinese ruler was normally male and Han Chinese. However, Buddhist rulers changed the very notion of the son of heaven itself and therefore included both women and non-Han persons in their ranks. We know that the Sui and the Tang had steppe ancestry. In fact, Valerie Hansen has shown that the Tang also, in fact, spoke Turkic at home. And we know that China had only one female emperor in its entire history, and it was precisely in this period, Empress Wu, in the middle of the Tang period. But there's more, actually, because Buddhism did more than simply transform Chinese kingship. It also transformed China's place of itself in the world. In the process of transforming China into a Buddhist holy land where this ruler could rule as an ideal Buddhist ruler, he had to create, or she, in the case of Empress Wu, had to create these stupas, had to patronize Buddhist monasteries, had to collect Buddhist sutras and relics from South Asia itself to make China an integral part of the Buddhist ecumeny. And in doing so, of course, China realized that India was the original home of Buddhism and not China. And this mattered because in the traditional Chinese legitimizing ideology, there was one Tianxia, one all under heaven, and the Chinese ruler ruled all under heaven. But in Buddhist cosmology, there were 4 continents. India was in the south, China was in the east, there was a continent in the north and a continent in the west. But what this means is, in Buddhist cosmology, China was just one tiny quarter of the universe. And therefore, scholars like Ford and Shun have argued that when Buddhist worldview met the Chinese worldview in this period, it made Chinese rulership of the Son of Heaven seem like a local rulership, as opposed to Buddhist rulership, which was truly universal because Buddhism covered the entire world and not just China. So in fact, Chinese documents of this period refer to India as Chongguo or the Middle Kingdom. In fact, the other names used for India are Western Heaven and Heavenly India, which of course have implications because the Chinese ruler is also the son of heaven. And therefore, the point being that China, in fact, suffered from, quote unquote, a borderland complex because India was the, quote unquote, central Buddhist land, at least when seen from China in this period. And therefore, scholars of religion and state making in this period have argued that by the 7th century, at the latest, it was clear that China was not the center of the world, and the Chinese knew that too. At the same time, when it comes to interactions between China, Soitang China, and East Asia, it should also be emphasized that we have been told, and it has been shown that states, recognizable states in Korea and Japan emerged during this exact same period. But we also know that Korean Buddhist monks also traveled to India to study Buddhism at Nalanda. And we also know that Chinese culture spread into other parts of East Asia, Korea, and Japan through the vehicle of Buddhism. So Buddhism was an integral part of the state-making process in Korea and Japan. Just like China was transforming itself into a central Buddhist land by creating monasteries, collecting sutras, relics, etc., so were Korea and Japan transforming themselves into central Buddhist lands. And it's in that context, we are also told that Tang China's influence radiated in that part of the world largely and primarily because of Buddhism, although, of course, there were a bunch of other reasons as well, which are well known in scholarship. But I wanted to emphasize the Buddhist dimension in particular. But none of this actually makes this an India-centered world. Even though the Chinese might have had a borderland complex, because India was itself a realm of multiple polities, multiple large and small polities, some Buddhist, some Hindu, and some even Islamic in this period, because Sindh had become Muslim by this point in time. You know, I spoke about Arab invasions in the early part of the presentation. My point simply being that there were multiple registers of universal rulership. And no Indian polity in this point of history actually made claims over China, even rhetorically. Although Indic-Buddhist polities, of course, claimed, the rulers of Indic-Buddhist polities, of course, claimed that they were the real Chakravartin rulers, the ideal Buddhist rulers, just like the Southeast Asian Buddhist kingdoms rulers made those claims for themselves. And like I said, Korea and Japan also emerged as centers of Buddhism. So my interpretation is that, in fact, this was a period of multiple centers, some large, some small, but all with universal pretensions. And therefore, this was a thoroughly decentered world, a thoroughly decentered Asia in particular. And so as one opens up East Asia and looks at East Asia within a connected framework with South Asia in this period, one does not find China at the center. It is a decentered world within an interconnected Asia. I'd now like to move on to my second case, which of course is the colonial period. And my point here is, of course, similar. It is about the interconnections between South Asia and East Asia, as opposed to the traditional way of understanding the opening up of the closed system, as we are told that East Asia indeed was. I think I have tried to show that East Asia was not closed in the prior period, despite assertions and claims otherwise. But nevertheless, in this period also, it was not a core periphery encounter in the way it's traditionally interpreted, because it was a three-way encounter that also included India. And I would like to show this through the three modes of interactions that I mentioned earlier. So in terms of politico-economic interactions, what is often overlooked in a lot of scholarship is that the British Empire, in fact, was a narco-empire in Asia. For the British Indian polity in particular, opium was the second largest source of revenue after taxation on agriculture in India itself. And this opium trade between British India and China was extremely important because what the British essentially did was exchange Indian opium for Chinese tea, which produced British profits. And this was extremely significant because prior to the conquest of Bengal, which initiated the conquest of India for the British were paying for Asian goods from both India and China with bullion, with hard currency. But as a consequence of these quote-unquote arrangements, British essentially obtained the Chinese tea for quote-unquote free. Very important in terms of economic interactions. Likewise, political military interactions between South Asia and East Asia were a key part of this Euro-Chinese encounter, if you like. So in the first Opium War, for example, roughly half the troops were Indian from British India. In fact, it is not often recognized that the Treaty of Nanjing was signed aboard the HMS Cornwallis, a ship of the British Navy that was built in India by an Indian shipbuilder in the early half of the 19th century, when India did have considerable shipbuilding capabilities, which were, of course, then lost over the course of the colonial period. Likewise, Indian troops participated in the Second Opium War, and along with the British and French troops, destroyed the Summer Palace in Beijing. And the Chinese were very aware of these, the involvement of the Indians in this process alongside the British. So, for example, 100 years after the Second Opium War, a Chinese general told his Indian counterpart that the Chinese people will never forget that the Indians, in fact, did do that too. Likewise, in the Boxer Rebellion, the Indian troop contingent for British India was the second largest foreign troop contingent after Japan. Indians were also present in every single British treaty port along the Chinese coast. By the 1920s, for example, in Shanghai Police Department, there were more Indians than there were British by a factor of 2 to 1. I guess the point I'm really trying to make is that India was present in China in military/security roles in this period, and was a very visible symbol of China's quote-unquote national humiliation at the hands of the British itself. What's more is there were more Indians than Americans in China in the first half of the 20th century, something that we often forget. So when it comes to the British opening up of China, given these politico-economic and politico-military connections, the military historian Geoffrey Parker has argued that it was not simply the British Industrial Revolution and the power generated endogenously in Britain/Europe itself that opened East Asia. And in fact, he's very clear that it was actually coupled with the conquest of much of India that created the resources for the British to do so in the first place. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, that we have to look at Asia within an interconnected framework to be able to truly understand this. Very interestingly, the Chinese actually did understand how this worked. So for example, Matthew Mosca has shown that in this 19th, 20th century period, the Chinese polity recognized that, in fact, it was facing the same power along its 3 frontiers in the China Seas, in Tibet, and in Xinjiang. And before this realization, the Chinese polity had different frontier policies for these 3 frontier regions, but it was only through interaction with British India, Mosca argues, that China's frontier policy got transformed into a foreign policy. Likewise, I have a quote from Sun Yat-sen that I've put on the slides here. And his essential argument is that Britain was this global superpower because Britain had control over India. And of course, there's an exaggeration in Sun's statement. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Chinese realized that they felt British power via its Indian intermediary and not directly from Britain itself. But it was more than simply politico-economic and politico-military interactions. In fact, there was an ideational dimension to this as well. We know that throughout, the nationalist narrative of China is one of century of humiliation and how China wants to become strong and powerful like the West and Japan. The other side of this story is often lost in the quote-unquote Eurocentric accounts, because what China did not want to be like was India. In fact, a whole new historical genre appeared in China in this period called quote-unquote lost country histories, countries that were lost to colonialism. And India was the foremost negative example, the foremost lost country for China in this historical literature. So while China wanted to become like the West and Japan, what China did not want to become like was India and avoid a colonial fate for itself. So in stark contrast to Buddhist India of history that produced a borderland complex in China, colonial India, in fact, was the foremost negative example for China that was doing the bidding of another power, in this case, Britain. And in a separate paper a few years ago, I have also argued that, in fact, contemporary China's disdainful attitude towards India is precisely rooted in these colonial interactions. My point, again, simply being that the Western encounter with China was indeed a three-way encounter at the politico-economic, politico-military, and at the ideational levels. So in conclusion, I guess what I really want to say is that there was no timeless Sinocentric system in historical East Asia. Now, of course, China's connections or East Asia's connections with other parts of the world waxed and waned. Sometimes East Asia interacted in a different mode with Southeast Asia, sometimes in a different mode with Inner Asia and with West Asia, and so on and so forth. And we need to, quote unquote, open East Asia as opposed to a priori assume that there was a closed system. Because contemporary world regions were not past international systems. So my larger argument simply is that historical Asia comprised multiple partially overlapping, open, and interconnected international orders. And arguably, the future of Asia will be similar through American, Chinese, Southeast Asian, and other order building processes. There's never been one single order covering all of Asia or any of its subregions. And I guess the point that I really want to emphasize is that some of the scholarship on what is Asia keeps on debating between whether Asia is one or Asia is many. And by contrast, I'm arguing that actually, whatever the answer to that question in a specific time period, my emphasis is that Asia is not disconnected. I am in this paper showing connections in certain periods between South and East Asia, but East Asia and South Asia were also connected with other parts of the world in other periods of history. And therefore, the main insight that I am arguing that Asian history can bring to our understanding of orders is that these kinds of multiple partially overlapping orders can be viable and long-lasting, but they do get lost in the traditional Eurocentric and Sinocentric accounts. Thank you very much.